in the preamble to this webinar and also the terms of reference for the project, there are four very important questions that this paper have addressed with a varying degree of intensity depending on the context. It's about the control, the extent of the control on the private sector, the instruments that has been used to exercise this control, the private sector, the political economy considerations, the impact, the multifaceted impact of attempts to control and contain the private sector, and how could actually developments, reforms, and political evolution could actually lead to a better use of the private sector as contributors and partners in development of the state. So without further ado, turn over to Ishaq, who will be moderating the webinar.
Thank you. Okay, so really my job today is to try to keep us focused and on time so that we can be out on time. Ibrahim, you've introduced the subject beautifully. We have great mind with us to explore really the to understand better the politics of state-business relations in countries where this has been understudied in the past, and at least for ERF, it's a foray into understanding a little bit more how Sudan, how Ethiopia, how Algeria, and how Iraq work. Also, I think the paper on Iraq will not be presented today. So without further ado, let's start with let's see who is number one on the list. It's Alex with Aditya. So let's see. We have 10 minutes is short, but let's try to keep to the core messages. And after you, we'll hear from Alamayu if he comes from Ethiopia. So Alex and Aditya, the floor is yours.
So I'm going to ask, it's great to be with you, and hopefully we will get to meet in person. It has been far too long since I have been in Cairo, and since I've had the chance to meet those of you whom I know in person. I'm going to ask Aditya to actually kick us off, if that's okay.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Alex, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone, wherever you are. Our paper is titled Thinking Politically About Money, the Changing Role of Political Finance in Political Unsettlements in Ethiopia and Sudan. And we really began with a methodological challenge, which is that scholars rarely compare Sudan and Ethiopia. And the historical political economies of the two countries are so different that undertaking a comparative case study is usually only possible at a high level of generality. But there are obviously some similarities. Countries share a common border, they share the Blue Nile, and political and economic challenges which range from separatism to chronic food insecurity. Both states nearly collapsed at the cusp of the 1990s. So where they really radically diverged is in their developmental strategies. Sudan is usually described as a classic example of a kleptocratic political system, which has been characterized by transactional political practices of military, business, and political elites, what Alex very persuasively describes as a political marketplace. On the other hand, Ethiopia was, at least until very recently, characterized as a developmental state, which is one in which the state allocated rents strategically within a highly centralized and autocratic political system. So Ethiopian elites forged what the economist Stefan Derkon calls a developmental bargain, a commitment by the political elite to delivering economic development. Sudanese elites did not. So if we were to broaden the scope of our analysis, the nature of the political settlement, which refers to the distribution of balance of power between elites, played a really key role in defining the developmental paths of the countries. But that begs a second question. Why did such different political settlements emerge in the two countries? And this is quite important from a political perspective, because does Sudan's experience hold any lessons for how we understand Ethiopia's predicament today? And is a developmental state likely to emerge in Sudan? What would be needed for this? So rather than going through the paper in any degree of detail, I want to highlight two key findings, and perhaps we can go into greater detail in the question and answer. And these findings are more in the nature of hypotheses and need to be tested elsewhere. So the first point I want to make is that political finance, and I'll explain what I mean by that term in just a minute, has been a really key factor in shaping the political settlements in both these countries, always mediated by violence or coercion. What do we mean by political finance? We use this expression to refer to the discretionary cash which is available to a politician, or the politician's ability to give or deprive a person of material rewards. That's prominent in what Alex describes as a political marketplace, but it can exist in other political systems as well. It's not quite the same as the official budget or state finance, and it is also distinct from the broader political economy, which usually refers to the broader relationship between political institutions and the economic system. Analytically, it's not even the same as corruption, though the concepts do overlap. And definitions of corruption are usually always connected to the ideal functions of public office or a political system and the distortion or subversion of those functions in the pursuit of private gain. With political finance, the expression which we are using, is much more concerned with why political systems are organized the way they are and the political objectives for which proceeds of corruption might be used. So to reiterate, it's the nature of political finance, that is, what form it takes, how concentrated it is in the hands of politicians, how easy it is to divert for political purposes, where it comes from. All of these factors shape political settlements. And obviously, this relationship is not one way. The nature of political settlements also affects what kinds of political finance is available. Now, compare the trajectory of Sudan and Ethiopia in the 1970s and 1980s. In the 1970s, Sudan's political economy was based on agrarian capitalism, borrowing for development projects, Islamic finance, and remittances from migrant workers. President Nimeri did not have exclusive control over any of these sources of money. So he was only one of several players in the political arena, competing with others to distribute largesse in the form of patronage. By the late 1970s, Sudan's debt-fueled economic boom had come to an end, and macroeconomic crisis was deepening. And of course, we know the story. What followed was extraordinary period of austerity, where the state withdrew from multiple facets of public life. But it was the lack of political finance which really shaped the state's strategies of rule, especially in the way it organized violence. So, most crucially, control over violence was privatized, deregulated, and decentralized, especially in peripheral regions where militia proliferated. Because the principal means of material reward available to the bankrupt Sudanese state was granting of license to pillage, militia looted and burned and killed their way through vast swathes of southern Sudan. And of course, the thing was that the opposition to the state was organized in much the same way. In the words of its founder, John Garang, the Sudan People's Liberation Army was a mob which he spent years trying to reform. On the other hand, political finance in Ethiopia was centralized and came from outside. It was foreign military patronage which sustained the Derg military regime through state crisis in this period. After the overthrowing of the imperial government in 1974, the Derg junta ruthlessly centralized power, and its economy and experiments in socialist engineering, command economy and experiments in social engineering, proved to be economically disastrous. And in the absence of substantial domestic sources of revenue, it was external military and financial aid from the Soviet bloc, which sustained the state and allowed the Derg to create a massive military party apparatus and assemble the largest conventional army in sub-Saharan Africa. All this during a period of deepening economic crisis. And similar to Sudan, the rebel movements which emerged in Ethiopia and Eritrea also mirrored the state form. They looked very much like a centralized political system. Now, I want to come to the second key conclusion which emerges from our paper, which is that political leaders almost always seek to exert control over and centralize the sources of political finance, whether to stay in power or to pursue developmental or ideological projects, or both. And where politicians are able to do this and are able to operate according to a relatively long time horizon with a developmental mindset, we see sustained economic growth. And this is because political settlements create institutional configurations in states which are difficult to alter in the short term and can sustain growth episodes through periods of domestic and global turbulence. But of course, short spurts of economic growth can also occur due to things such as commodity exports. So for example, Sudan's oil boom period. And it's interesting because in the 1990s and the 2000s, the rules of politics in each of Sudan and Ethiopia stayed largely the same, even as their political economies were transformed. In Sudan, transactional politics were well established by this time and had been shaped by the austerity politics of the 1980s. What the oil boom did was to simply increase the scale of bribery and patronage, and the centralized flows of political finance in the form of oil rents strengthened those who controlled the state or the state form. So after the Comprehensive Peace Agreement was signed in 2005, the SPLM in southern Sudan took control of oil revenues and was able to outspend al-Bashir, creating a vast patronage mechanism centered on the army. So the changes in flows of political finance reconfigured elite dynamics and elite positioning, but the rules of the game stayed the same. In Ethiopia, on the other hand, what you see after 1991 was after the end of the civil war, was the creation of a federal system and a focus on economic development. Here, the EPRDF leadership channeled political finance through state and party structures, restricting parallel sources of political finance, and had a notable commitment to development, especially after the contested elections in 2005, where the EPRDF decided that its political legitimacy depended on delivering basic services and rapid economic development. And this was financed through generating rents from state control over strategic sectors of the economy, at the same time as increasing amounts of external financial support were mobilized in the form of official development assistance, concessional loans, and debt. And politically, the developmental bargaining was being delivered through a highly centralized and authoritarian political system. And essentially, the nature of the political settlement and the centralization and bureaucratization of political power allowed for political finance to be centralized and yoked to the project of building a developmental state. And so for 15 years after 2004, Ethiopia's economy was the fastest growing in the world. Though, of course, questions remain about whether growth was equitable. So let me stop here because I think I'm out of time with one last sentence, which is that if these hypotheses are correct, scholars and policymakers studying and working on war and development in poorly institutionalized countries need to be a lot more attentive to how politics are financed and the way in which finance shapes the organization of violence and political settlements. So let me stop there. Alex, do you have any sort of concluding remarks?
Let me make a couple more remarks. The first is to repeat that well-known Russian phrase, "To destroy is not to build." And one of the lessons from both countries is that it's much easier to dismantle institutions than it is to reconstruct them, particularly under these circumstances. The second is to repeat another formulaic question, which is really, what is the possibility of a small state, and in global terms, both Ethiopia and Sudan are small, a small state with an open economy. How can it sustain cohesive governance in an integrated, turbulent global economy? And the posited answer, but from the developmental state era in Ethiopia, was to have a sufficiently autonomous state to be able to carve out a niche in the face of the forces of the neoliberal global order. And that, of course, has been jettisoned in the last 5 years. Neither country has achieved that political economic space to be able to pursue a sustained autonomous strategy. And from our point of view, key to that is neither of the governments has access to sufficient political finance over a sustained period to be able to consolidate the domestic political arena, what we would call the political marketplace, and neither is able to control it by force. And therefore, I think we see, just bringing the story a little bit up to date, the two transitions in the two countries, the one headed by Abdallah Hamdok and Ibrahim here, in which they tried to move from this kleptocratic system to a more developmental system, and obviously did not succeed. And the transition in Ethiopia in parallel, which was in the opposite direction, from a developmental system to one that is openly and candidly kleptocratic in the sociological sense of dismantling the rule-bound system. It lead, I think, to the starting point of Aditya's remarks, which is that perhaps the two countries are converging in their overall political economic systems.
Thank you, Alex. I mean, two things. First of all, this is fascinating, and you know, it's clear how two neighboring countries are at the opposite ranges of a large kind of possible range of political orders. In many ways, you make a lot of this. So it's a very interesting paper at the end. Even though we knew at the beginning it was very challenging, we end up learning a lot, especially now that they seem to converge. Number two, this presentation takes longer than 10 minutes, so it's going to be a challenge to keep up to 10 minutes. We've been saved here by the fact that, unfortunately, Alamayu couldn't join us, so he won't present his paper on Ethiopia unless he makes it late. But it's not the first time he's not managing to connect from Addis. So we'll move immediately to Adil, who has, I know, studied this paper. I'm sure, very interesting things to tell us. Adil?
Thank you very much, Ishaq. Great to see you and other colleagues. I really enjoyed this paper. I'll be very brief. I'll try and wind up my comments in 5 minutes so that you have more time for the other papers. I mean, my comments are really by way of sort of curiosity and explanation. I think the story that you paint is very believable, and it is quite convincing. I think a great strength of the paper is the way you directly link with the way in which politics or existing systems, political economy is financed, and you link it with violence. And of course, we know this whole framework on violence and social orders and all sorts of frameworks. But that link with coercive actors and their incentives is extremely important. So I think that I really liked. And I also liked Alex's final sort of comments, and particularly how we think about small states in an integrated world. You actually look around everywhere in the world, you find that a lot of the countries are unable to exercise the full entire spectrum of options that are available, because in part there are political constraints at home, but there's also a constraint of operating in a world that is integrated, but where there's also growing geopolitical competition between various powers. So I've got three broad comments, if I may, very quickly. One is that obviously elites and the type of rent streams they rely on play a very important part in your analysis, Aditya and Alex. But I would like to know a bit more about, have a more structured discussion of elite incentives. What governs these incentives? And there's clearly information on that scattered around the paper. And also the fact that you, at least in the context of Sudan, you talk a great deal about rents right? So sort of oil rents, which end up reinforcing same institutional structures, right? Even in that moment of transformation. And given that you link with violence, it would be useful to know the incentives of the coercive actors. So in a sense, in both of these contexts, in Ethiopia and Sudan, the incentives of coercive actors of the state and mapping them is really, really crucial for any story of development. And this particularly also, I think, way back in time, Robert Bates, when he wrote that book on prosperity and violence, he actually also singled out the way, those who have coercive power, their incentives, in a sense, really matter. So that's one about elite incentive. The second is really about the analytical utility of this concept of political finance, which obviously you link it with political settlements framework, and you highlight how this, the way finance, basically supports an existing political equilibrium. That sort of element is available in other approaches too. So I wasn't sure what analytical utility that focus on political finance brings per se. Not that I don't believe it. It's an interesting term, and I think it does what it is required to do, but the analytical utility was not clear. And third is really this thing about, I'm being pedantic here, but the thing about case selection. They're both neighbors, and there are many similarities, but in a sense, the historical trajectories are also very, very different. I mean, Sudan was a colony of the British. It was subjected to very different historical forces, a different way in which the Sudanese elite was patronized by the British, different kinds of investment programs, including the construction of irrigation canals and the relationship with land and power. I mean, there's that history. And then Ethiopia, if you look at the global sample of countries that were colonized, Ethiopia is one of the very few countries, developing countries in the world, that was actually not colonized, if I'm not mistaken, right? And so the historical trajectory and the forces that operated there were quite different. And that is not to say that we cannot compare the two cases, but it is just to make that historical trajectory more explicit, because the two transformations or transitions that you are talking about are placed in a broader sequence of events where historical legacies or historical antecedents might have shaped the way two institutional structures responded to those transition points. But overall, very interesting analysis, and I learned a great deal. Thank you.
Thank you, Adil. So we've been joined by Alamayo, which throws our timing a little bit. But I think let's keep in mind, Alex and Aditya, perhaps the question on what is political finance, if we have time to get into. I think it would be useful for the rest as well. Hi, Alamayo, and happy you're able to join us. But I must say, we kind of adjusted to your absence. Unfortunately, we used part of the...
I thought it was on Sunday. I had a... And then I just got an email from Ramaj and came back.
Look, great you could be with us. Could you possibly present with your son? Very good.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe together you can present just kind of the key.
Well, we present together.
But I mean, you have a very long paper. It's a book by now. Super interesting. You think you can tell us in say 5 minutes?
Yeah, I can do that.
Kind of the bottom line. What did you discover about the linkages between power and money, on the nature of state-business relations and how it has affected the recent trajectory of Ethiopia? What's kind of... Let
me do it in 5 minutes. Therefore, it's not necessary to have had a PPT, but that will consume time. So basically, what I learned from this exercise is number one, there are different theoretical analytical frameworks that have been deployed in Africa. This is the political settlement, neo-patrimonialism, rent-seeking, and what have you. But what I learned was that each of them explain a bit of the part. So I couldn't, say this is the best framework to do this issue. That's number one. And probably for you guys in political science, the Kaliskian framework for me, what I call the intermediate region, I use that pretty much, and Kahn's political settlement. So the conclusion is, from analytical perspective, probably the best approach is to explain different aspects using different analytical points. That's number one. Number two, in Ethiopia, in this particular case study, the state capture concept is a bit reversed, in the sense that it's not the private sector that captures the state. Rather, the state organized along ethno-linguistic groupings captures political power first. And once that group captures political power, then it creates myriad of firms of its own, party-owned firms, military-owned firms, and run them with crony relationship with them. And second, it also controls the existing, apparently feeble, but the existing private sector. So, capture is conditional on political capture. The third point I learned from this exercise is that state power capture gives resemblance of stability. Therefore, investment by private sector will go on, by the state sector will go on, but the political settlement that Kahn was talking is unstable equilibrium for me. That's what I learned. That Kahn assumed that political settlement is some kind of stable equilibrium which reproduces itself. What I learned from the Ethiopian case study is that, well, that is completely unstable equilibrium, in the sense that the moment a small group captures the state structure and start to run firms of its own, as well as state-owned firms, as well as manage the private sector, other ethnic elites start to organize themselves because they believe they don't benefit as much as the one in power. And that leads to contestation of power and the instability that we witnessed in Ethiopia the last 2 years, including the war. So that's pretty much, I think, my 5-point thing. What I did was, just to add one more, I tried to categorize firms into 7 categories. Civilian state-owned firms, military state-owned firms, party-owned firms, large and medium-scale firms, and FDI firms, and try to map the relationship that each of these firms have with the state. Is that okay, Aishak?
Yeah, no, this is great. I think this is to the point. Thank you very much. We're gonna go back to Adil, and it's good we have like 10 minutes left for this. So, I mean, most discussion resemble a lot the North kind of matrix, where you start with an initial settlement and it evolves from personified to, either it stays chaotic or it builds institution and kind of evolves towards more stability and more value added. And so, Alamawi described basically a power coalition that make deals, and these deals are basically as stable as the regime. As long as the regime is stable, they are stable, but then there is contestation, perhaps by those predated or pushed out, and so it destabilizes the deals. And it resembles in a way your description, although your description is, well, I shouldn't be discussing, I should go back to Adil. But I'm interested, Adil, to see if you can toy with this kind of two ways of approaching it, right? The Ethiopian way, which is organizing, and the Sudanese way, which is how you can try to make sense, get out of chaos by how the threat of violence organize a way out of chaos.
Yes, so thank you. This is very useful, and I really like the summary of the paper in 5 minutes. In fact, less than 5 minutes, you did a great job. I mean, I guess my sense of sort of engaging with these different frameworks, including Mushtaq Khan's, is that really we are looking effectively, if you take away the terminology, political settlements, violent social order, right, Rand theoretic frameworks, etc., developmental state, we're really looking at different configurations of economic and political power, right? And these configurations are going to vary in different contexts and shaped by the underlying institutional realities, which includes both the ethnic makeup, the type of the regime that you have. And I agree with you that in the Ethiopian context, it is not that the private firms are capturing the state, but it's actually firms are being created through the initiative of political action. And I thought a better framework, I mean, you talk about all these frameworks, you have Mushtaq Khan and others, but I liked the sort of discussion in Luigi Zingalis's paper in Journal of Economic Perspectives, A Political Theory of the Firm. And in fact, when Ishaq and I were writing the introduction for our book, we placed even the Middle East and North Africa in that spectrum, where Zingalis talks about a sort of balance of economic and political power, right? So the balance of the state power and private capital. And he says there's almost this kind of Goldilocks equilibrium where, the number of outcomes or configurations are possible between two different extremes. One extreme is that, there is sort of all the capital is owned by the private people, and they are sort of capturing the state regulation, they're capturing the state system, right? And then you have the other extreme where firms themselves are very much a product of states' political action. They get created through states' political action. And countries can fall either along this spectrum, right? And it seems to me that Ethiopia is closer to that setup where firms are being created through state action, right? So it's not that the private firms are capturing the state, but they're being born through that state action. So I think it might be useful for you to engage with that literature as well, and you will find greater analytical traction in then describing Ethiopia, which part of the spectrum it lies closer to. The other comment I have is that I really liked your characterization of different types of firms, and it was clear that, because of the unique or distinct political economy of Ethiopia, you have firms that are civilian owned, they're military owned, they're party owned firms as well, because there's a very strong sort of, for a long time, it's been a party state. And that brings in that interesting dynamic. But then I was a bit surprised that you started looking at the relationship between those firms and the state, which is clearly an important element. But there is another part, which I think even Ishaq, you would be interested in, which is how these firms actually interact with each other, because they're part of the same business space, right? They might be competing for their profits in the same market, or they might be partitioning the market to make sure that there's part of the market that the party is active in and part of the market that military-owned firms compete in, and then there's civilian. And in a sense, it's not just the relationship of these different types of firms with the state that matters. It's also the relationship that these firms have with each other. And so I would be curious to learn a little bit more about that. Yeah, but other than that, I think it's an interesting framework.
Super, thank you, Adi. So maybe we go to Alamayu to answer that, and then we'll go back to Alex and Aditya, maybe to conclude with your thoughts about why are these two cases so different. Adi put various hypotheses on the table, history, ethnic compositions, and the like. It'd be great to have your current bottom line on that. Alamayu. you're mute. Anama, you still mute? Yeah.
Did you get a chance? Okay. Sorry, I missed. It was broken, so I just heard the last part of the comment. I missed the other.
I think the
one you talked about, what is the relationship among firms?
Yeah, I think that's the key question that Adil asked. If you want to comment on that, the relationship between
I missed a good part of
firms.
Yeah, I missed a good part of Adil's comments, but the last one I heard it. That the one he asked about the relationship among the firms. I just looked only. I actually I didn't say it, but I also explained that one. Like there, the party firms have a policy of what they call self-sufficiency within themselves. Therefore, if there is a textile factory owned by the party, then it necessarily have to buy the cotton produced by the party firm. So they have their own sort of self-sufficiency scheme. But the military firms enter into connection with them because the military generals belong to the party. So I tried to show also that link. Like for instance, from the central government, from the federal government, the military firms will take a big contract in billions. For instance, one of them is the dam on the Nile. Then when that military firm is not able to do the job, it just subcontracted to the party-owned firms. So I've tried to really explain that, but not as deeply as the state-firm relationship. Probably I will try to emphasize those parts. That's what I heard, Isaac.
Thank you. I think Brahim wants to come in before we conclude, right? Still mute, Brahim.
This is a burning question in contrasting Sudan to Ethiopia. I realize the importance of time, but I just want to pose it. Ethiopia between 2004 and 2019 had just a tremendous gross performance. And in fact, in 2010, the IMF characterized Ethiopia as the fastest growing economy, developing economy or economy in the world. And it was very clear that there was something, going behind this structure. Could it be, for example, that as Paul Collier suggests, that one levels of productivity is the capacity of the state to coordinate firms in order to cooperate, not just to compete, but also to cooperate. And could it be that because the state created these firms, and it was very clear that there was some element of developmental strategy and thinking under the leadership of Meles Zenawi then, was it that perhaps maybe a reason that Ethiopia has an advantage in that sense? Because not only the gross, but even value added per worker has significantly, precipitously increased during the period. If you compare with Sudan, it was the worst case of crony capitalism, where there was no developmental vision, and the economy actually stagnated despite the presence of the oil, and that the economy of Sudan was much more endowed initially than the economy of Ethiopia. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Okay, let's see if Alex and Aditya found the answer.
Shall I try it?
Why don't you come after?
Okay.
Let me very quickly float answers or responses to Adil's three questions, and then Aditya can contribute something probably more insightful than mine. The first is about incentives, and here I would point to Bob Bates' other book, When Things Fall Apart, and the importance of the experience of crisis, the experience of catastrophic meltdown in governance capabilities that he describes there, which I think was a deeply imprinted upon the elites of both countries, and the element of the sense of fragility among the elite in Ethiopia, I think cannot be during the developmental state period, has to be factored in. I mean, the national security strategy of Meles said very explicitly, national disintegration cannot be ruled out. So that element, they looked very confident. Inside they went, they were deeply anxious. So the incentive of survival, and that is a key factor linking control over the means of coercion, over control over political money. What is the added analytical component of political finance? I think here we get into it, drawing on that previous point, into the importance of transactional politics, because when institutions fail, or when institutions are in fear of failing, then the transactional element comes to the fore. And that, I think, is where the element of that discretionary political budget that does not have to be accounted for, that is extremely flexible, it becomes very important. And I think that is the added element. It works in that context of theorizing the transactionality of politics, something that political economists have on the whole not explored. And your last point about case selection, well, the cases were selected for us, and I think what we found particularly fascinating, actually, is precisely the point that you make, that they have such different histories, and yet there seem to be important ways in which, under the common pressure of the global political and economic order, they are showing signs of convergence. But Aditya, I'm sure you have more to say than me.
Super quickly, 2 points. I think one is to build on the second point of the idea of political finance. And I think the other concept which comes closest is the idea of rents, obviously, which is something that Mushtaq Khan talks about in his political settlements framework. And I think, obviously, we use the expression political finance in a transactional context, but it is also broader than rents in a sense, because political finance or sources of political finance can be altered by changes in the political economy, which can't just be reduced to rents. So in a sense, the concepts overlap, but they're not exactly the same. So that was very quickly one. The second was on case selection. And as Alex said, I mean, they might be converging at a point. And what was interesting to us, again, taking Bob Bates's When Things Fell Apart framework, was the experience at the end of the 1980s, where both countries were under an enormous amount of pressure from global political and regional political economic changes. And there, what seemed to be the sort of key difference was the way in which political finance defined the political settlement and then separated the developmental parts of the two states. So in a sense, despite that very different history, they made for an interesting comparison, which is not to, of course, suggest that we're going to shoehorn Ethiopia and into Sudan and vice versa and say they're the same. They're not. But there are interesting convergences in their political and developmental trajectory, which we felt there was an interesting tension which we could tease out through this comparison. Over.
Thank you, Aditya. Alimayu, on the success.
I think Ibrahim's point is great. Actually, I've also documented that, not only on cloud, but also on infrastructure, like education, road. In short, something like 65% of the budget has been allocated for the proper sections. The growth is also excellent, although it's not as exaggerated as officially stated, 11%. I believe probably 6-7%, which is the best by African standard, top by African standard. But probably what Ibrahim needs to take into account is that how is it financed? It was basically financed through external debt and monetization of the deficit. And the financing comes, that led to macroeconomic instability, inflation financing, foreign exchange shortage, depreciation of the currency, all this macroeconomic instability, which again open the opportunity for cronyism. So that's, I think, a point to be made. Otherwise, you're right that the capacity of the government to organize was important. The problem is in developmental states, you need two things. Not one, such political organization capacity and hegemonic ideology, and second, a state capacity, technocratic capacity to do the job. The second one was missing in Ethiopia. The first one was there. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me conclude this session with four minutes delay only. I think it was fascinating. We've learned a lot. We're going to extract more from this comparison. I would say two things. One is the political usefulness of this elite extraction was described as gluing elites, perhaps to some extent clientelism, but also in both cases, I found that very interesting, control over political money, as you put it, Alex, right? So some predation to weaken the opposition, if you like, which is something Adil, in our book, we bring out, and I think it slightly adds to other kind of literature. Now, on the case of Ethiopia, I mean, from my own observation, having lived 5 years in Addis, it seems to me part of the explanation, fits nicely with the Northian framework, which is, the power coalition was small, so it didn't require to tax the economy so much in terms of France. I don't know if Alamayo agrees with that, but it was small for historical random reasons. Basically, it's a small minority in a country where there are two large majorities, and it had to do just enough to satisfy those majorities. And even though we saw corruption rise with time, it was a small group that had to eat, and feeding that group allowed space for the economy to grow. I mean, that would be my own explanation, which people may disagree with. 2:50 or 3:50 in Cairo, definitely time to move to the next session, where we're going to dig deeper on Sudan. We start, Kabashi, with your paper, fascinating paper on cronyism in Sudan. Are you with us, Kabashi?
Yes, I am with you.
Okay. Can you, in 10 minutes, give us your main findings?
Yeah, I will give the main finding, but I have to do a trade-off, either, to mute, to stop the video so as you can hear me well. And I'm going to share my PowerPoint from my view. If this is agreed, I will go on. Is it okay?
Go ahead.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So the basic objectives of the paper, given the term of reference, is to identify the major changes in state business relations that created influential historical legacies, state-private relation in the 60s, privatization in the 70s, the rise of oil rent in the 90s, and clientelism, cronyism, party predation network in the 2000s, and the state disintegration in 2011. also wish to highlight the political economy of these historical legacies. And also, are you hearing me? Hello?
Yes,
we hear you.
Yeah, okay. And also we'll explore the ways of disciplining the politician, examples through democratic accountability, decentralization, etc. So the conceptualization of the state-business relation is a major challenge. The literature is new, and it focuses on the literature focusing on LDCs is new, and focus on implementation of policies rather than on the political economy of the policy themselves. And indeed, of course, if a free market mechanism is well working, there is no need for extra mechanisms called state-business relation. So, therefore, these relations involve political economy issues from the start relating to market failure and collective access problem, which loom high in the less developing countries. Then the question is, why is the state, as a benevolent sovereign, engaged with the private sector perceived as diverse household, business, and firm, and why it engages the way it does? And despite the importance of the question, there is no agreement on an analytical framework that links the state-business relation to a broader political economy theory. And there is, of course, this paper will not exempt from this shortcoming. And also, more important, there is a justification for a lack of political economy state-business relation. And this because empirical studies on these relations focus on how they are configured on a specific policy rather than on why and how themselves are formulated. And after a desperate review of argument, Waterfield and his colleague posited a theory of political economy building on three propositions. One, political survival is a key incentive for state rulers to coordinate with private sector. Two, whether rulers share mutual interest with private sector to create productive ends. Three, whether they are able to craft pockets of efficiency in the bureaucracy in charge of implementing the policy. In contrast, rulers may face incentive to survive on unproductive rents via corruption, colonialism, predation, and North and Algeria have highlighted many mechanisms on this regard. And hence, drawing on the literature on business state relationships, the question addressed in Sudan are how the policies adopted by the state rulers shape the state business relations, and why some achieve better outcomes than others, and why some rulers survive on leveraging rent from productive sectors while others prefer unproductive sources. And what are the implied concrete state business relation deals in each case, and how the private capitalist farm and firms are incorporated in the rural deals? And what are the policy implications of these experiences? This question I framed them from the literature on state business relations. So in addition to this literature, the paper also draws on the socio-political economy advanced by North and Somoglu and Robinson. This theory, in general, assumes that violence is, violence is shared. So I will just focus on the main issues that I need from this theory. So the problem of violence, control, and economic rents are the key axes of this theory. Ascending the space of social order in this axis is conditioned by fulfilling three rules: rule of law, perpetual state organization, and a scope for controlling organization as well. North applied this frame to historical data and identified three types of social orders, and within the limited access order, he identifies three types of state: mature, basic, and fragile. And he showed that this classification is dynamic. State may progress or may regress. So this means important to look at the state as an institution that conditions the choices of the elite. And now, of course, in the same vein, Somoglu and his colleague developed a political economy theory of development to answer a key question: why some rulers achieve better outcomes than others. And in this theory, the evolution of power of the society and the power of the state are the key axes. They applied the framework to gain historical data and showed that various trade-offs are possible. And in one extreme, when the state dominates, authoritarianism becomes the norm and ruler decides for society. And the other extreme, when the state is fragile, a complex set of informal traditions becomes the norms for regulating individualized societies that does not trust the rulers. A major conclusion in the comparative political economy of development and state business literature is that the emergence of powerful elites who coordinate rather than fight is crucial for coercing state business relations that are also decisive for transitioning up the spectrum of state types, including types of social order. So the methodology took two steps. First, capitalize on the degree of separation of the military, economic, and religious organization, which account for the quality of the state and fulfillment of the three condition outlined by North. And since land is most abundant compared to capital in Sudan, it is assumed that the control of expansion of the superior landmass, including its zone of influence, determines significantly the transaction cost. That is the positive externality of sovereignty. Policing, security, contract enforcement, and so on. And that in turn reduce transaction costs and boost trade and ground in private activity. Thus, the effectiveness of the state is qualitatively represented by two coordinate networking, sovereign land mass in the vertical axis and transaction cost in the horizontal axis. So progressive solution to the balance problem, the configuration of state business relation is expected to move simultaneously upward and towards the origin reflecting gain from sovereign business zone of influence and reduction in transaction cost. So this the second step just applies the.
Sorry, Kabashi, we're running out of time.
Yeah, I'm just coming to my results.
Yeah, we'd love to hear the conclusion of how coordination.
Yeah, so I applied this framework, which on one hand measures the quality of the state, which is determined the choice for the elite. On the other hand, it shows the effectiveness of the state business relations, or the organization of the state business relations. So the outcome shows that there are major shifts in configuration of business relations in Sudan. And each one represents a relocation away from the previously better dependent configuration of this relation, reflecting shrinkage of sovereign land mass, including this business zone of influence, and a swell in transaction costs that heavily weighed on the development of private sector. And two broad conclusions could be drawn from this taxonomy of state for Sudan. Of course, I have been drawing from history of Sudan dating back to Funj Kingdom. So one major source of continuity follows from observations that all rulers in Sudan followed Islam, permanent institution inspired for Islam, like Bet al-Mal in al-Mahdiya and imperial treasury of al-Funj, and also the Sudan political civil service during the second colonial period, and Jazeera port during the post-independent Jazeera. So the other source of continuity relate to Musharaka institutions which have been deployed by colonialists to build the state-led venture, the state-led private sector relation venture in irrigated agriculture. In the lens of the industrial policy approach, the major sources of tailwinds that is supported the continuity of this relation is that strengthening of existing institutional private property rights and also massive mobilization of of broader segments of population beyond those who control the state, and implementation of a comprehensive plan measures that boosted land productivity and backup of the progress who effectively implemented the state plans. So domestic private business significantly boomed on the back of analyzers need to follow the state-led business, private sector, private tenant export agriculture. Outside this zone, business continued as usual in agriculture, benefiting from after knowledge of the zone outside the major state activities. Those who lose or lost protection of pre-colonial systems, including those that access to the colonial institutions, over time become dependent on those who are fortunate. And I'm just yeah.
Will you conclude?
Maybe I'll go for conclusion. I have done some comparison, but let me go for main conclusions, assuming that people have read the paper, or at least might discuss it. So the policy implication. Firstly, the articulation of reform agenda, including state business relation by political actors and popular discourse, is not enough. Marshalling the political will and the state power remain major determinants of the reform implementation. Secondly, enactment of transformative state business relations require full authorization of state programs who know the policy agenda and the method of negotiating it and coordinating its execution. For example, as I said, rulers have tolerated such programs during Mahadism, during the during the colonial era, and even in independence, as affected by Jazeera Board. Thirdly, the delay of implementation of the stabilization policy negotiated in the context of the HIPIC, which is an important condition for successful for success of any state business relation, provide an example of incompatible political train of thought on the reform. First, lack of interest in the policy, lack of power to commit to it, and lack of know-how to implement it. And fourthly, the policy void created would be filled anyway by foreign interaction and or by politician own contributions. Fifthly, sanctioning a national development agenda is needed for fulfilling policy voice and for anchoring perpetual alternation of civilian government political rules. And finally, a state business plan should not sidestep the compensation of the losers, and their interest should be upfront negotiated in the policy agenda. Maybe I have, I said finally, but I guess I have, so yeah.
Thank you.
Maybe 1 minute. That is. I will stop here.
Thank you, Kabashi. This is an amazing sweep in 10 minutes. So we're going to move to Ibaidallah, who has a more precise, easier topic, I think, and then we'll go to the commentator. Ibaidallah.
Okay, thank you so much, Ishaq. 10 minutes or more?
No, or less.
Or less.
I think, the less time, the more you can focus on your important results.
Okay, I'm trying to finish in 10 minutes. First, my co-author, Dr. Muhammad Al-Haj, the main author, he apologized to join us, perhaps due to the technical problem for Khartoum. So our paper about the political Islam and chronic capitalism in Sudan, the case study of Munazzamat al-Da'wa al-Islamiyya, or after MADA. So let me share my screen, I think. Can you help me to share my screen? Yes, this one, okay. So, yes, I'm trying to go fast. So, Munazzamat al-Da'wa al-Islamiyya, I think, is unique
I
case.
don't think you'll be able to do 31 slides. So think of a strategy where maybe you give us the introduction and then you move to the conclusion, perhaps.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So, yeah, this case study is the unique case for crony capitalism because it links religion to politics and economic interest, which is different from other cases because here the religion is very important factor behind the economic interest. So MENA, which is dominated the business sector in Sudan since 1990 or after al-Bashir coup in 1989, the MENA dominated the business sector. So according to the act of MENA, the main goal of the organization is to support the Islam. This was the main goal, but actually this goal represents about 5%. And maybe like more than 90% of the activities of this organization focus on a business sector, on investment and private sector in particularly. So based on this background, the main objective of this study, I couldn't see the, yes, the main objective of this study is to investigate the role of political Islam in stimulating cronyism with focus on MENA business in the last 3 decades, or actually during the al-Bashir regime, the last 3 decades of al-Bashir. So the secondary objective of this study is identifying the mechanisms through which MENA business had dominated a large segment of private sector in Sudan. And the second objective, estimating the share of MENA companies in Sudan economy. The third, examining the role of MENA in sustaining Islamist authoritarian regime. The last one, identifying what did Islamists or the followers of National Congress Party gain in exchange for the privilege they provided to MENA firm. So our paper started by introduction about the establishment of MENA. So منظمة الدعوة الإسلامية established in 1980. But before the coup of al-Bashir, has focused mainly on the charitable activities, and just has like 5 business or companies before al-Bashir. But after that, this organization grown heavily based on the act received in 1990s, which is the act of 1990s. The Islamist regime issued the new act, called it the MENA Act, to organize the mission of the organization and to give it more discretion to carry out mission. So the main goal or the main factor behind the growth of MENA, this act, 1990, because this act provided a lot of incentives and privileges to this organization to get, for example, tax exemption and financial freedom, export and import, and exemption also in goods, and also provided land for the organization. So as stated that the key goal of the organization is to propagate Islam among non-Muslim communities. However, the same act granted MENA the right to run business activity and provided it with many privileges. So accordingly, MENA had engaged in a wide range of profit-oriented business activities. These include a set of companies working in many sectors, including contracting, agriculture, manufacturing, financing, and service. This also is another unique in the case of MENA, because most of the cronyism cases focus on a single sector, for example, agriculture or telecom in other countries, for example. But in case of MENA, focusing or dominated the whole business sector in Sudan, engage in agriculture, infrastructure, for example, industry, even education and health sector, even transportation. So the whole business sector of the economy has been dominated by the companies of MADA. So we can go jump to the business, how the MADA engage in the business sector. As I mentioned, the main factor is a goal. The main factor is the Act of 1990. The government of Sudan granted MADA generous privileges and incentives to engage in business sector. So following the issues of this act, the number of firms owned and run by the organization has skipped dramatically. So indicating the significant contribution of privileges and incentives provided by that act. So the data collected from the commercial registrar head office in Khartoum showed that before 1990, the organization administrated only 5 business entities. So as can be shown from this table, so just 5 business or 5 companies before 1990. But as we will see from the table after the coup of al-Bashir, the number of companies have grown rapidly. There are maybe more than 50 companies registered by the Munazzamat al-Dawah al-Islamiyya after 1990s. So this it make clear that the Act of 1990s give MADA a lot of support in order to grow rapidly. So also some data show that the company or the MADA organization had many bank accounts in dollars, in euro, and even in real, in other currencies. So the cash. So this also made clear that the MADA had received a support from the government in order to open an account and also to export and import commodities without any taxes. So how these companies or this how MADA increase the number of companies, this can be explained by many privileges. First, tax exemptions, because the Act of 1990s gave the tax exemptions for MADA. So provided it is business with unlimited tax exemption in export and import. So this also provided the MADA power in order to increase its business. The another one, the financial freedom, which also, as I mentioned, the government gave MADA financial freedom, like opening account and also managing hard currency. Even during the time of shortage of hard currencies, this MADA possesses a lot of amount of hard currencies, meaning that it has exempted from regulation. Also, regulatory exemption was one of the reasons behind the growth of MADA businesses. Access to land, also the Act gave the MADA access to land without any restrictions. For this reason, MADA owned a lot of amount of land in very expensive area in Khartoum, in Riyadh, for example. Some statistics show that the number of land increased after 1990s due to the 1990 Act. This some information about the numbers of land owned by MADA, which is amount or is very valued in terms of US dollars. In Riyadh, Al-Kuwait, Bahri, Kafuri, in very expensive neighborhood in Khartoum. So this it means that, as I mentioned, this act had give very impact to growth of MADA. So now I can go to the benefit, also regulatory incentive, as I mentioned, one of the reasons. So we can go to the, or before that, the share of MADA in the business sector due to the lack of accurate data. So we can say that the MADA has a big share in Sudan economy, or in the private sector in Sudan economy, because it dominated the whole economic sector or business sector, agriculture, industry, transportation. So this table show approximation the value, estimated value of the assets in terms of assets. So this land, buildings, also vehicles, companies' asset, cash impacts, inventories. So, like for example, maybe like 4 billion or million US dollars, which is a huge amount compared to the other companies or other private sector.
Vaidala, we're running out of time, although it's fascinating. If you can go faster, please.
Okay, I will go fast. Okay, I will go fast to what the Islamists or the National Congress receives in exchange to these incentives. So MADA provided Islamist cadres or the National Congress Party with job in exchange for privileges provided to its firm. So all the employees of MADA were from the National Party's followers. This also the exchange or the gain from these privileges. So also the information showed that the MADA received support or the government received support from MADA, and MADA was a main factor or main supporter of the coup of Bashir in 1989. So finally, we can conclude that the case of MADA is very unique case because it relates religion, politics, and economic incentives. So I think it needs more in-depth studies in order to understand how much the loss in incentives or the economic incentives given by the MADA, because the country lost a lot from these incentives without any real exchange. So the real benefit went to the National Congress Party followers, not the country of Sudan. This is very important. Also, I think there are other factors maybe supported or were hidden, which is not clear due to the lack of or shortage in data. So also, finally, I can say that the challenge of data collection or the lack of data was a big problem faced this study, because actually before the COP of 25 of October 2021, collecting data was easy, but after that we face many problems. So I can say that this case need more investigation in order to show how the MADA benefit from the government, and also in exchange the government benefit from MADA, and how also affected the economy of Sudan in general. And thank you so much. I think
Thank you for fascinating paper and being on time more or less, and Kabashi also. We have to read your papers, they're very rich. Now, Mr. El-Tigani, we are eager to hear your comments. If you can stay to between 5 and 10 minutes, please.
Okay, no problem. I'll take that 5 minutes, or still within that time frame, because I was just getting out from another conference. So thank you so much. I think for Kabashi's paper, I think it's a very interesting paper, very deep analysis. I personally learned a lot from this from the state-business relation, and also the author is very systematic in targeting the arguments, and also they put it in a very simple terms about the relation, state-business relation, or whether we are going to talking about the private sector relation or public-private partnership. These are all buzzwords, but at the end of the day, it's about the mobilization of the resources and efficient allocating of the resources. And also the state institution will play the role, whether the state is going to be coercive or building the trust among the business relation. And it is true that is clearly from the objective is the state of the Sudan is a failed or the fragile state, especially during the Inghaz period. Is very clearly it's a fragile state. And the author is trying to look on all those legacy, historical legacies of the state business relation that is going through it, whether that is going through the Mahdist period or going through even going back to the old history of the point time framework. So it was very good at transcending it and coming the narrative, thinking very well on that relation, whether they're talking about it's the cultural dimension of it. And I was keen to see that the author, what about the cultural legacy? And the cultural legacy here is probably is reflecting on the Islamic tradition. And that has some sort of an impact on that relationship. So we see that musharaka, this one of the things, Beit al-Mal has become one of the ways to get the rent. But probably it might be better to think about, I was just thinking that the historical part of it, if we talk about the French Sultanate, why not the Darfur Sultanate? And what are the criteria that you are just chosen the French Sultanate rather than, for example, the Darfur Sultanate? So that could be giving some sort of rationalization why we're excluding this versus the other ones. And also the other thing is that important is during the post-colonial period is very distinctly the people have a citizenship right. Either they are participatory or as citizens. But on the other sultanate, those are all subjects. People have no rights, people have no influence. So those are the different political dynamics. So we've got to be very careful if we try to bring those, lump them together and saying there is a need of that, we can pull it through. The other thing that's also is very interesting, the author is using the North arguments and basically pushing that there is a role of the institution are there are organizations are there, and also there the private sector is over there and they can merge it there. And if there's the violence in the social order, how we're going to suppress the violence? How we're going to suppress the violence? Because the violence has inverse relation with the rent. To get more rent, we need to see stability and peace. And so for the country of Sudan, it's true the sovereignty of the state has shrunk substantially post-colonialism, and also and also the violence has become exponentially growth recently in Sudan. And so the state have no ability to control. So from that angle, also the system of government is a bit different to the government once they become weakened. Also the federal system is further either weakening it or strengthening it. So it could be very reflective on that. What about the role of the federal system? And even the nature of the fiscal federalism that we have. And in this sense, we have that paper that also is coming in the same paper, in the same project. Myself and what's her name is Nada Isa are pushing it, also giving some sort of an aspect about the nature of rent, because the state tried to give devolution of some powers. On the other hand, also giving more responsibility to state to organize in the business relation during the Inghaz period. So it might be worthy to give the reflection on that ones. The other thing that also I felt it's important about the elites, the power of the elites. And they are, it might be worthy to look on the perception of the elites, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa. There was, I think there was an article on public perception of the rentier elite in the Middle East and North Africa. It might going to give you some sort of a data. So I want to see that is, I wish that in the future, this paper would be even developed further, and a person could go and get a data, really data about the perception of the elites, and look for the people perceive the elites themselves and how they're gaining power. Even the business also are gaining power. So what that power of those was, it was it to reflect on that ones. So I think the paper is quite fascinating, very interesting, and it's a new. That's a good thing about it. It's a very new contribution, and I love that paper. Just digression for the Vedalas paper about this, about the Munazamat al-Dawah al-Islamiyya, and I'm just thinking that is this area is very fertile and there's a lot of research need to be done. But I'm just thinking that it should be much better. That is the way we look on this thing. Yes, organizations ought to grow. This is a natural thing. Yes, they can take every opportunity to grow. They have a lot of equity, a lot of assets. What is the important thing is the corruption in that organization. That's the lens that we have to look at it. Where are the corruption? Where the hidden corruption that is going on? If the assets are there, it's belonging to Sudan. If the lands are there and very valuable, it is inside the Sudan. No worry about that ones, because it is an asset that is there in the country. The other thing, if it's running Islamic schools or running the schools or taking care of nursing homes, I think those are good things. Those ought to be. The bad thing about the transition is they went and destroyed those things. I will never do that. If I'm there, I'll put a new management to take care of the organization rather than dismantling the organization the way it is. And also citing my friends Salamana and Wedi, these are political actors. They are not going to give a credibility to the research. So it's better that the research would be get the fact that you're looking for rather than this narrative of the politicians who are just fighting with each other and making buzzwords. So, and thank you so much. I can stop there.
Thank you very much. This is great. We're only running a few minutes late, which is good. Let me take a few comments before we go back for a minute to each speaker. Who wants to come in? Okay. Well, I'll make a comment. I've learned a lot, I must say. We're moving from a framework where we economists describe the economy and say that, decision makers are irrational, they're ignorant, they should do the right thing and they're not, to a deeper understanding of what we know calling the political economy. They're not that irrational. There's not just money, there is power, and aligning money with power gives rise to stuff that we call corruption on the surface, but which has to do with political finance and the need to keep a coalition together that could create trend and not just exploit trend and the like. And I think we have a framework that can describe what is happening in a more informed way. But this also displaces the question, right? Then the question becomes, instead of why don't I shout political recommendation to those that are ignorant, we always end up saying, how can we foster more cooperation, less costly governance, ways to make the pie larger and to interest leaders or regimes to not accept to have a large share of a small pie, but rather to be interested in growing the size of the pie. And of course, this is much more slippery, but at least I think it's moving the question in the right direction. So, when we have recommendation by Kabashi, they are more sophisticated than simple just policy recommendations. And in addition, I must say the paper in Ibaidallah has done something even more than give us a narrative that seems more logical. It starts actually measuring, for example, the mechanism that he showed us, so that we strengthen the narrative with the beginning of proof. At least we know the mechanisms, and I guess the next step along that line would be to show how those mechanisms deform the economy and how costly they are, for example, to the growth process. So I think all this is very useful. I think we're gonna go to Brahim and then to the two speakers for a minute each.
Thank you, Ishaq. I'm wondering whether we can probe into the factors that actually caused the kind of the initially fundamentalist Sunni Islamic kind of doctrine that the guardian of the coup of the movement, Hassan al-Turabi, tried to instill as a compass for the Yanghaz regime, for the Salvation regime, and how actually, despite his very strong grip on the movement, what role actually did rents and distribution of rents and the failure to agree about distribution of rents kind of led to the deterioration of the system, led to the deterioration of the system from a limited access order to basically a fragile access order where the state simply was unable to or did not agree to invest and grow, and that eventually set the stage for the demise of the regime. I think it would be interesting to assess the historical past dependence since the beginning of the coup, and what are the considerations behind his followers to put him in prison the first 6 months or 8 months, whereby they were able actually to set the stage for their eventual control of the regime and to force him out. And that was the beginning of the unraveling, I think, of the ideological kind of cohesive element of the regime. So this is just a point to Dr. Kabashi, if this is something that might be of interest to probe in a little bit, because at the beginning in the 90s, we all thought that we are in for an Iranian type regime that is going to stay forever, and didn't materialize, thanks God for that. But I think it would be interesting to maybe to consider that dimension. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Well, that's an optimistic view. Could have been worse. Kavashi, can you respond in a minute?
In a minute. Maybe I've spent a minute sharing my screen. I want to share a graph. Can I share this graph? I have a graph I want to share.
Sure.
Yes. Could you see this graph? Could you see it?
Yes.
Oh, no. Yeah.
Try to make it larger.
Yes. Yeah.
Try to make it larger.
I just lost it.
Yeah, it's the slide before.
The slide before. Yes.
Yeah. Yes. Okay.
Now, from my reading on first come to Hamad al-Bashir, why Darfur, why Sultanate al-Fawj, and the culture behind that, and then come to Ibrahim. Now, from my reading in the political economy literature of makeup of states and on the state business relation, I try to get scoring on both hands, how the state itself as an institution determines the choices of the elite. And on the horizontal axis, the transaction cost. On the vertical is the land mass. It's supposed that the larger the land mass, the better for the private sector and for the elite. They will both increase the pie by reducing transaction costs through boosting trade and private sector activity. So I tried to rate the state system since Al-Fawj. Al-Fawj is the top because at that time it is include Darfur, Al-Fawj, and Kordofan, and its size is 4 times the size of Al-Inqas, of the state received at the Al-Inqas. And that state is only managed by police. And it is influence or business don't influence North Africa, West Africa, so it is very large in that terms. And therefore is there in this configuration. It's not certain Al-Fawj because Al-Fawj and Kordofan, the three of them make the greater Sultanate Al-Fawj. And I hope the reform should make it objective. Let us go back to Sinar, the cross, and make Sudan the crossroad for Africa. Go this way. And then as we move, as time run down, the post-colonial state is better, and then the second colonial is even better, and then the Hadith. I mean, the worst ranking is for Ali Qas. Even it is more worse compared to the first colonialist in terms of land zone, land mass, and zone of influence. Now, what amazes me is that all elites in Sudan sees Al-Fawj resort to Islam for ideation of their agenda, and for mobilization of citizens, and for rule of law. However, Ali Qas digressed from this fundamental rule. And why? Because they invented a new law. They not resort to Islam to inspire ideas, no, but to change the international law. And this is why they created a big sovereignty gaps between the de jure state and de facto state. And this gaps is very serious for the international community. And maybe the pressure came first from international community. Qas in 1993 was declared as state sponsor of terrorism. And since that time, a flare of sanctions has been imposed in Sudan by UN, by EU, and so many. And these sanctions to date, and even embargo from the SWIFT system, and these sanctions remain to date effective. And unless there is a serious reform, it has become very difficult to exit this triangle of sanctions, fragility, and shut off from the SWIFT. Of course, normalization, which is expected to be negotiated in the context of the HIPC, will help to exit this triangle, and also very, very informative for crafting, for stabilization of inflation and stabilization of business environment. So I will stop here, and I may come back if there is time.
Thank you. Ibrahim, you got your answer? No, you're mute. You're mute. Sorry.
I was just meant to raise this question. I know it requires a different, more detailed historical analysis, just to make the point that actually the loss of the ideological compass might have been a factor that created some sort of a past dependence since what we call in Arabic al-Mufasala, when they basically separated and parted company, you know, in 2000 or 1999 or something like that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Ibaidallah, last words.
Yes, thank you so much. So I would like to thank Dr. Al-Tijani for his comments. I agree with you. Yes, these assets are inside in Sudan, but I disagree because this asset is owned by one organization, MADA. Why is MADA only MADA, not other companies or other private sector? So because this is the kind of corruption, this cronyism is a corruption, because the environment or the investment environment in Sudan during al-Bashir regime is only for these organizations and also for the militants and Danfodio owned by MADA. Those are dominated the business sectors, but while the foreigners, the other investors from inside, they are not able to compete. This was a problem. So regarding the second point, our data, not only narrative or from those, Salah Manna, also we get information from the commercial registrars, and also we did interviews with previous employees in MADA. Also we heard the both those are supporting and also those that are not supporting the mother. So we are trying to be fair to hear the both voices. And thank you so much.
Thank you to our speaker and discussant. I feel that with your work, we've made a major jump on starting to understand the political economy of Sudan with your work, both historical and quantitative. So this is, I think, very promising for continuing to think about those issues. Thank you. And now we moved a bit north and a bit west to Algeria, another mysterious countries. And we have two great papers by Mahoob and by Idris. Mahoob, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you so much. Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be with you, and thank you for having invited me to this amazing and fantastic session, because I was very, very much interested in the two precedent sessions on Sudan. I would like just to tell you that this paper is not really related to the business relation between companies and state, but the paper of Idris, which is just coming after, is completely focused on the chronism, the specificity of the Algerian chronism. What I want to do, I would like just to share my yeah. I hope you will see it. Have you my graph? My
yes, very much so. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. So just to tell you what I want to do in this paper, I take the opportunity of thinking about what can the new authorities of Algeria do with this rise in hydrocarbon prices, revenues that just happened quickly since the 2021 and 2022 because of the war in Ukraine, for example. Is it going to modify the fundamentals of the Algerian economy, or are there some opportunities to change the regime of the growth of Algeria and the relationship between the state and the companies? And I think that it is really time to use this opportunity to change the rules and to implement new reforms, and that's why I propose these 10 actions for a new industrial dynamic of emergencies in the industry and the knowledge-based services. Just to tell you two or three comments about the new situation. The Algerian economy has entered, since the changes, since the changes in the political direction of the country imposed by the Hirak in 2029, it has entered in what I call a air hole. It's in French, I will say a trou d'air, a sort of a collapse, a mini collapse, I think. And what I mean is that the authorities, the new governments, the new direction thought to put an end to the relationship between the privileges between the state and some companies. All these companies were organized in an organization that is called CFE, FCE, Forum des chefs d'entreprise, Forum of the head of companies, the CEOs. And of course, they have been, for many of them, arrested and put in jail. But what has happened is that the economy does not seem to have found the necessary relays in the private sector. So that's why I call that, I don't know how to call that in English, but air hole, okay? So the economy of Bouteflika, when you see what has happened during more than 20 years, was based on the close relationship, but you call chronism. But I think in the Algerian case, and Idris is going to come back to the notion of chronism in the Algerian case. In the case of Algeria, we can more speak about vassality relation between the government, the political, the direction of the economy, the militarians, to be more direct, and these companies and this head of companies, because it is not a deal, really a deal between the companies and the state. It's really a relationship between a relation of vassality. They have to do what the government says. Of course, there is a deal in the sense that they obtain privileges, and these privileges are not dedicated to the other companies that are not organized in the Forum des Chefs d'Entreprise, for example, and they are organized mainly in think tanks, like, for example, other kind of think tanks. CARE is a think tank which organizes some companies that are not related to the state, to the political party in the power. And gas and oil resources, which represent more than 1/3 of the GDP, allowed to finance a large sector of imports. Just before the Iraq uprising, the economy has suffered from a collapse of its foreign reserve change from $200 billion to 20. So it has for more than, they have been divided by 10. After the fall of Bouteflika, vast majority of private business leaders associated with political power in a relationship of structural cronyism have almost been arrested and imprisoned, and their tangible and intangible assets were confiscated by the state. So that's the situation. The situation is not that you have a reallocation of the assets, but an accaparement of these assets by the state, by the government directly, which has become the direct owner of several conglomerates of Algerian personalities in the building and public work sectors, as well as in the agri-food industry, for example, and in the manufacturing sector. So to continue the story, after this, what I call the air gap or the air hole with these companies, you have no transition, and unemployment and inflation rate has increased dramatically, and the twin internal and external deficits have also increased. So what happened, just independently of the policy that the government decided to implement, just for exogenous reasons, you have this breath of fresh air that has happened for the government. And this breath of fresh air was related to the rise in the price of hydrocarbons following the end of the lockdown and the Russian war in Ukraine. And so this has given a relax for the macroeconomic constraints of the governments and the ability it has to continue to subsidize consumption and housing households. These subsidies represent more than 10% of GDP. So you can just see at this graph, you have in red Algeria, and in green Middle East and Central Asia, and the other countries are emerging market and developing economies and advanced economies. So we can see here that the current account balance in percentage of GDP is very volatile. The amplification of the variation are very much more important than for the Middle East and Central Asia, even if it follows the same shape. This curve has the same shape, but you have seen here that between 2014 and 2020, the GDP, the current account balance, but also the budget deficit has increased dramatically in percentage of GDP. And when I speak about fresh air, you have this reduction of the deficit in 2020, thanks to these new shocks that I was talking about just before. So the sudden rise in the price of hydrocarbons are something that question what the government is going to do with that, are the government going to change the fundamentals of the Algerian that I recall in the paper in the section 2, so I won't come back to this. What does the new situation bring with it? So this section 3 deals with that point, and how can Algeria take advantage of this windfall for its macroeconomic balances? And we think that it's very urgent to use this new unexpected and exogenous margins of maneuver in the Algerian economy to implement real structural reforms and establish an industrial policy adapted to the new configurations of globalization. This is what I want to present here. And if you see, the moment is a privileged moment, because the determinants of the global chain value location of fragments of the global chain value of activities are changing dramatically. You have this process of relocation on the regional basis for the manufacturing activities, but in the same time you have also an increase of the hyper globalization of services and digital activities. So what I think is that the government of Algeria, but also it could be the same for the other countries, could take this opportunity to implement new industrial policies. So if you look at the fundamentals of the Algerian economies, you know them, hyper concentrated and deindustrialized economy.
If I may interrupt you for a second, sorry. No, I want to interrupt you for a second to see how we can optimize among ourselves. So you've laid out your plan, and now you're going to demonstrate your points number 2 and 3. We're eager to hear that. And then Idris is with us, and we have Stefan also with us. That was coming in as a commentator, but he has to leave at 3 sharp.
Okay.
So I wonder. I don't want to interrupt you. I wonder if it would be possible for us to hear Stefan's thoughts, maybe not necessarily comments since we haven't heard the papers, but on the kind of Algerian conundrum, and then come back to you and then to Idris. Would that work with you and with Idris also? I mean, we're going to be a good 15 minutes late. Do you have...
No problem for me, no problem.
Idris, do you have hard stops like Stefan does?
No worries. We can do it that way.
We won't be too late. We'll just be a little late. And
no, don't worry about it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your.
Okay, so I stopped the sharing my and I will come back.
Yeah, and then we'll come back to exactly your demonstration. So Stefan, can I ask you to present your thoughts more like thoughts than
Yeah, I'm afraid that there'll still be sort of comment. Sorry about my hard stop. I gotta pack 6 kids into a car in exactly 10 minutes. So there's no way around it. Thanks for being flexible. Thanks, Isaac, and great to see you all. I'm afraid there's still sort of comments on the papers, but perhaps I can phrase them in a way that makes them more broadly relevant for the project. So I have more to say about Idris's paper because it's much closer to the concerns of the overall project. So I really like the overall argument of sort of an arc of cronies over time, how they start as sort of golden boys, have initial successes, and then this boosterism passes, and there's eventually an inevitable downfall in the shape of one scandal or another. And that could be a really nice comparative contribution to look at how this plays out in Algeria as opposed to other places where we got good technical literature. And one particular sort of comparative puzzle that I was thinking about is what about countries where the cronies are not kind of completely recent and regime created? What about countries, including in the region where there's an old and more stable bourgeoisie? So Jordan, Morocco, the GCC, I would presume that there's not this kind of typical arc. So perhaps what you describe is something that's more typical of countries with a longer kind of state socialist legacy, where cronyism then is created at a very late point on a large scale when there's sort of a first opening to world scale markets and countries where previously most sectors have really been run by the state. So perhaps specific to these kind of post-socialist countries. And then the points that you make about how scandals are triggered. So you make 2 arguments that can be the hubris of cronies who just overestimate their own autonomy and who get too hungry, or it can be sort of a general political purge, a recalibration of the equilibrium among political elites, and then cronies are sort of collateral damage or crony capitalists are collateral damage of the process. I was wondering regarding the Huber's argument, whether this isn't quite sort of case specific and potentially limited to a specific era, because there should be learning effects, right? Once someone has seen Khalifa or Haddad fall, like in Algeria, then sort of the next generation would probably be more careful. I wonder whether there's really sort of a repeat cycle of them getting too cocky and being cut down, or whether it's sort of more of a phenomenon again of the kind of early post-socialist opening where the system finds a new equilibrium and some overplayed their hand. I can't think of sort of a regular wave of purges in other countries that have a longer history of sort of non-socialist development in the region. And then one argument you make is that there's a concern about the political independence of capitalists, that people like Khalifa might have become too large and too independently powerful. And I wonder to which extent that is really the case. So what did he do to really mount sort of political challenge or signal political independence? Did he criticize major players in media? Did he try to finance his own political movement or something? To me, that part of the story didn't come through as clearly. There are stories of kind of crony capitalists, say in Russia, who very much became political actors and who overestimated their political abilities. Berezovsky, Khodorkovsky. But this was arguably sort of a story of much more open political ambition. I'm not sure whether in the Algerian case there was really sort of a recognizable ambition of creating an alternative center of power. And then I also wonder in comparative perspective whether the theoretical story is to an important extent about the fragmentation of political elites in Algeria, this very diffuse le pouvoir, which is again quite case specific. So perhaps the dynamics of purges and scandals would be different in other countries where there's a much more centralized, more personalized regime. So state business relations and the cycle of scandals probably is very different in a country like Saudi Arabia or even Algeria, where there's one kind of Egypt, where there's one kind of recognized top level leader and where there's not kind of repeat rebalancing of elites on the political side. And then the last thing I was going to ask about is that you point out that sort of relying on sort of diffuse market mechanisms to generate slow-based, more autonomous, less cronyist capitalist accumulation is not an attractive option for a country with a strong statist legacy and with rents like Algeria. But I wonder whether there isn't another path that hasn't been taken that would be interesting to discuss. And that is, why is the cronyism in Algeria and in the Middle East more widely, broadly speaking, why is it so anti-developmental? Because there are types of cronyism, there are types of close state business links between oligarchs, elite players on both the bureaucratic and the business sides that have been much more export-oriented, much more productive, much more oriented towards profound economic diversification, specifically in East Asia, but also in some other cases. So what is it about the crony capitalism in the region as a whole? And it's really a question that goes, to be fair, beyond your paper, that makes it so profoundly unproductive. Because there's not a necessary, it's obvious why cronyism can be inefficient, but there are counterexamples where it doesn't have to be, where those closed networks and even corruption and greasing the wheels is actually used to create relationships of long-term trust and accountability, in a formal way. Why does that never happen in the region? So I got some more detailed points, but I don't want to take too much time on those. I just wanted to say a thing or two very quickly about Mahoub's very ambitious paper that gives a great overview of the structural legacies and constraints of the Algerian economy. It has a lot of stimulating policy ideas. You very clearly said it's not about cronyism. It's not really about the core concerns of the workshop. But I still wonder whether there would be space to say more about the political economy of what you're trying to propose. What would be sort of the underlying political coalitions that would make possible all those policies that you propose? A lot of great ideas have been out for a long time, and it's arguably political economy constraints that hold them back from being implemented. So it's not a shortage of ideas, it's a shortage of political coalitions and institutional capacity to implement them. And related to that, I was wondering whether it would be possible to say a bit more about the institutional framework that you would need to implement your policy. So how can you get Algeria's institutions, the bureaucracy as large, the technocratic leadership, sort of coherent and predictable and responsive enough to create an institutional environment that's attractive enough for FDI attraction. So FDI attraction, technology transfer is rightly quite prominent in what you propose, but it's not going to happen without a much better institutional environment that itself is very much tied up with a broader distribution of political economy. So both in terms of cronyism, that on the top level makes the bureaucracy a very biased and very opaque actor, but also on the lower levels of the bureaucracy where excess state employment is part of the historical social contract, and that in turn also makes the bureaucracy very slow moving and very unaccountable. So can we sort of embed the great policy ideas that you have in sort of also a set of more political economy oriented proposals that set the political conditions for what you propose? I think I'll stop right here and still stay on for about 3 to 5 minutes, and then I'll unfortunately have to dash to our 7-seater and bundle the kids in.
Thank you, Stefan, and for being supportive throughout this project. So for Mahoob and Idris, this is an unusual situation where you have your comments before presenting or finishing your paper, and so you can respond as you present. So Mahoob, we'd love to hear your development now, given us the outline.
I'm going to go very quickly to the question of Stefan, because it's really the heart of the difficulties to talk about what kind of reforms or policies you can implement. I completely agree with him that it couldn't be done without real reflections on institutions. The problem is that you have this break in the hierarchy. The power in Algeria, the militarians have stopped this dynamic that could be a solution, an institutional solution for implementing new policies. And now we have to think about another kind of scenarios. You can have 2 or 3 scenarios, in fact. So I'm going to come back to that. Just to finish very quickly, to remind you the different situations that are completely stuck in Algeria. The concentration of the economy, the rent of hydrocarbon, and the fact that you have this increase in revenues since 2020-21 is something that is going to increase the something that I call the procrastinations in reforms, and as they are going to be able to succeed again, the population in the consumption, etc., the incentive to implement new reforms is going to be procrastinated again. And if you look at the main figures of Algeria, deindustrialization is very, very important. The place of agriculture employment, you can see that it is the lowest. It is in green here. You have the in red the Middle East and North Africa, and in blue you have.
Don't have your slides up. Sorry to interrupt.
So employment agriculture is really very low, and the labor participation is the lowest of the world, even the lowest of the lower than in the other Middle East. So all this in a situation where the demographic transition is stopping, and where the fertility rate of the woman is increasing again. So there is a huge constraint in the economy.
Mahoob,
And yes,
you don't have your slides up.
I don't have. Okay. Oh, okay. So it was just. Sorry.
We imagine the graph, but still.
Okay. Do you have them now?
Yes.
Okay, so I showed you this. I showed you this figure on deindustrialization in Algeria, this on employment in agriculture. It's the lowest part of employment in agriculture. In green, you have Algeria, in red, Middle East and North Africa, and in blue, you have upper middle income, and you see that you have a huge spread between Algeria and the others. For Algeria, the employment in agriculture is less than 10%, and of course, the labor force participation is the lowest in the world, even lower than in the Middle East and North African countries. That's what you see here, and it's worse for women, of course, for female. And in the context of a counter-demographic transition in Algeria, something which is going to increase the supply of labor on the labor market every year, and so what is the threat for the future? The rise in the gas prices could be exploited to make more reforms and actually implement them, but in the short to medium term, the demand for gas remains very fragile. Of course, the recovery of foreign exchange reserves eroded during the oil crisis is reducing the external constraint, but an increase in national gas supply requires surplus volumes once domestic demand has been met and contractual commitments to foreign partners honored. And the option of exploiting shale gas resources, whose reserves will be the third largest in the world, has become seriously considered despite the resistance and protests. So really, the windfall from the rise in gas prices seems to be strengthening the fundamentals of the Algerian growth. It's reinforcing the rentier state regime instead of helping to implement new reforms, and that's what we can be afraid of, because it may leave procrastinations in reforms a permanent zero value option, like at every time that you had this an increase in the oil revenues. So what actions? I will go quickly to the question of Stefan, because it's really the huge questions. Of course, we have to change the state, and in this part, you have this question of which institutions, and we cannot deal with that without speaking about the future of the Iraq movement, which is still important in the society, but even if it is blocked and if it is stopped because of the repression and so on. The government needs to have a council of economics, for example, or other kind of proposition and stop to be a directing entrepreneur like it's going to be the case since this whole air hole that I was speaking about. I won't comment every action. You can read the paper if you want, but I will just come to the industrial policy. I will just come to the dynamic of integration into global value chains. What you have is that companies in industrialized countries are more and more relocating their production process, their global value chains on the regional basis in Europe, for example, and it's a really good opportunity to think about how to implement new policies to enter in the regional chain value organization. To do it in the services, because the companies are robotizing their value chain process in manufacturing sectors, but in services, it's exactly the contrary that we are observing. The companies are more and more offshoring services, high value added services. So not only the low value added services, but also the high skill employment in jobs in services and digital economy. So we have to take into account this new situation, and then to think about how to catch up in technology and how to define a real attractiveness FDI policy, and also how to create technological parks, etc. The main advice is to strengthen on building comparative advantages in knowledge-based services. Why? Because of what I have just said before about the strategy of the big companies in the world to offshore their services more and more. I just give you a figure. In the OECD countries, 40% of the jobs in the manufacturing sectors are services jobs. Like marketing, research and development, logistics, etc. So these services inside the manufacturing sectors have been offshored, and the offshoring rate was 10% in 2000 to more than 25% today. So you have a dramatic increase in the offshoring of jobs, services jobs in the manufacturing sectors, and also services in the service sectors himself, like the banking sector, insurance, etc. So why I advise to start by targeting the knowledge-based services, because the imitation strategies that have implemented the Asian countries in the 70s or in the 80s are no more possible today. The reverse engineering is not an option because of the generalization of the intellectual property rights related to the trade since the TRIPS, the implementation of TRIPS in the WTO summit in 1994 in Marrakesh. And insertion into global value chains must target medium and high technology sectors, of course, but also high value added business services. And the second reason that I played for targeting the industrial policies on the service sectors is because of the huge part of the skilled and educated but non-efficiently educated people, young people, in many management and other kind of disciplines. You have a stock of human capital that is not used and that is expatriated a lot. So there is a solution for employing the graduated people in Algeria, women and men, in this kind of services. So to give a priority to activities with high added value, because the very fragile and volatile activities like information services associated with support functions, computer maintenance, tertiary functions of execution, call centers, all this kind of activities are too fragile, too related to the competitiveness based on costs. So, of course, yeah, we have to make choice and to go on service real high value added services. And the corollary of this strategy is to encourage long-term technological co-contracting agreements with foreign firms instead of just simple subcontracting agreements, which are more volatile. So I mentioned in the paper original equipment services that have used, for example, Asian countries, Asian companies like Samsung, etc. The seventh action that I propose is to develop a co-production strategy that involves in governments, firms, and civil society. And there is a third one about associating industrial policy with diaspora strategies. Algeria has no strategies in direction of its diaspora. In fact, it's a really an engine of growth and of implementing startups and etc. So there is really good measures to implement to associate industrial policy and strategies towards the diaspora, which is very important now. But the main proposition is to change the way that the public investment is financing the economy. In a rentier state regime, the revenues flow to the state, eroding the private sector, favoring public subsidies, public investments, and public sector hiring. So if you look at the Algerian banking system, which has a monopoly, in fact, a quite monopoly, with an important assets, but also with huge handicaps that are linked to its history and its economic and political structures. And for example, the inhibition to take decisions is really a problem in Algeria. The hydrocarbon boom, despite the creation of the hydrocarbon regulation fund régulation des recettes d'hydrocarbures in the early 2000s, has not been combined with the successful continuation of the structural reform program, and it has not been used correctly. This kind of tools has to be used in a counter-cyclical tendency and not in pro-cyclical tendency. And if you look at it, it has been used with a pro-cyclical way. So the economy is necessarily often subject to terms of trade shocks in period of price reversals and leading to a decline in real income. Building the capacities to allow long-term investments to succeed in investing in investments, like colleagues used to say, is very important. And then I have some proposition to create a sovereign wealth fund whose objective is to distribute revenues in an intergenerational manner and to create a smoothing food to smooth expenditure by setting up lower limits to the evolution of the expenditure. And the last proposition is to reform the hydrocarbon revenue regulation fund and establish long-term financing mechanism for the Algerian economy. This Fonds de recettes des hydrocarbures is just a treasury account of the state of the government at the central bank, and it is used freely. In fact, the government can thus pay all public debt maturities from this fund and use the resources released, and also use it to feed the budget of the state, of the government. The use of this fund as a part of the general government budget does not allow for an effective counter-cyclical macroeconomic fiscal policy, and the tendency towards preference for the present and maximum extraction of hydrocarbon rents, which is increasing with the new fresh air that I was just talking about in the beginning of my presentation, is really a problem, because of course you cannot just follow the rise and the fall of the prices of the revenues coming from abroad. So the questions of institutions and their transformation in the Algerian case must be asked simultaneously and closely linked to the question of how the authority should manage revenue volatility and long-term investment, and reform this regulation fund to make it more dynamic and using it as a resource for consolidating and promoting long-term financing of the economy is really an issue for Algeria. So we have to remodel this instrument by drawing inspiration from sovereign wealth. There is a solution which is to recommend, and that's what I recommended in a previous study, to recommend to make it more independent in the sense that you create a new bank, a new sovereign development fund, which is the same that la Caisse des dépôts et consignations, and you will put the half of the revenue that are put in this fund regulation, you put it in this Caisse des dépôts, and you make it centralized for the long term, and the government cannot use it anymore, because the uses of this kind of revenues could be the responsibility of an independent governance of the equivalent of the Caisse des Dépôts, the fund, the Sovereign Development Fund, which is something that has to be recommended, really. And just to conclude, because this is the use of Fond de Régulation des Hydrocarbures, you can see that it is really used pro-cyclically and not counter-cyclically. So you see that it has been increased in the 2000s, like the revenue of hydrocarbon, and then when you had no money it has been definitely exhausted, and now it's something that is going again to increase and to be used with a pro-cycle way. The question of Stefan is really the important question. You cannot recommend these actions without thinking about which kind of institutions. And in the Algerian case, the real problem is that you have 2 or 3 situations to try to deal with. The first situation is that you have a hyper-centralized administration with huge authorities that make all the responsibles at the local level or the responsibles of the companies, the banks, inhibited in applying reforms because they are afraid of the political decisions that could be taken abroad. This is the first problem: how to make the reforms really implementable, and how to stop with this inhibition to take decisions at any level of the society. So this is really the first point. The second point is how to promote decentralizations, real decentralization and autonomies of regions. So it's something very important because you know that even if we have a decentralization, a deconcentration, the central state government is very powerful at any level. So there is a real problem of reform of institutions, and thinking about a new federal system in Algeria instead of the Jacobinist system inherited from the Soviet the Soviet shape of government, or the French Jacobin government. It's really an issue. Decentralization, autonomy of regions is really, I think, the second issue to deal with, to make these reforms implementable. And the third situation that is really complicated is how to give autonomy to the private sector. And giving autonomy to private sectors means having at the first stage a real regulation of the property right, and of the property of the land. So there is a huge issue of law and regulation that has to be taken into account to help change. But all this cannot be dealt and thought without thinking about the future of the social movement, the Hirak movement, which was promising real institutional changes. I stop there.
Thank you so much, Mahou, for this 10 points national plan to regenerate Algeria. I mean, let me just remind everyone that this was written at the time where the Hirak was rising as a plan for the future. And of course, things have changed, but it remains a plan for the future. And Idris's paper was also written when some of these cronies were still alive and kicking. And I must say the Sudan paper was written before the coup, And the Ethiopia paper was written before the last civil war. So, events are moving fast, but that doesn't mean that the analysis is not valuable, since everything remains so path dependent. So the learning is still useful. Idris, Atuadu, tell us about Algerian cronies.
As you pointed out, things have been moving since. So I think the latest update from the paper is just from a few weeks ago. So this is how much things are moving. Yeah, first of all, let me thank you all for the opportunity, and it's a fascinating topic, and particularly to thank Niwan for supporting me and doing the research on that. And Stefan's comments were particularly relevant. I really enjoyed them, so I'll try to address them at the end as best I can. I will try to stick to the 10 minutes. Yeah, so basically what we started to do at first is, I think, try and de-isolate Algeria a bit in this type of research, because effectively there's a lot of research happening in Algeria, but it didn't necessarily until quite recently use the term capitalist cronyism, or crony capitalism, and the reason why was because Algeria in some ways was historically more French speaking when it came to research, or more Arabic speaking, but not really English speaking. And so as these new concepts emerged, there wasn't immediately a need because tools existed locally, but because of the Iraq and the Arab Spring and things like that, people needed new tools to analyze what was happening. And this is when really it emerged on the Algerian scene that it was a relevant concept to the study of what was happening. So, and looking at the Algerian example, what I tried to do in the paper was take some case studies that people could then use to have some basis and see exactly how you could, through concrete examples, see how the wider mechanics of the whole system works in the country, but also try and see what's relevant in the Algerian example to crony capitalism around the globe and vice versa. And so one thing that emerged quite clearly was that historically crony capitalism happened at an interesting time for the whole world, which was the neoliberal reforms of the 90s. So again, as Muhub underlined quite well, it's a very centralized country. And in that sense, liberalization at that time meant moving on from a socialist model, centralized system, theoretically, in the discourse, which fragmented, very fragmented, that did not necessarily want to relinquish some of its power, including economic power, but particularly the political power, to a new economic elite. So it became much more about controlling the neoliberal turn of the late 80s, but particularly 90s in Algeria, early 2000. That created this crony capitalism in such a way. Before that, you could argue that they were precursor, but it would be very we're discussing today, like state crony capitalism maybe, or things like that. But so I tried to take the example of 5 scandals that kind of give a timeline of what happened in Algeria. And the very first one is the Khalifa scandal, which starts in the early 90s and ends in the early 2000s, though it's still going on through various lawsuits. But really, Khalifa was active from the early 90s to the early 2000s. He was a very successful businessman, one of the first ones to build like a conglomerate that eventually was also present in banking, in aviation, in the media, so ended up in prison, which is quite an interesting point. Then kind of mirroring the case of Khalifa, you have on the other side, much more recently, the Haddad scandal. So Muhum mentioned the Business Leaders Association, Business Leader Forum, le FCE. He headed the FCE up until the Iraq and is now in prison. And again had a large media group by the end, also had investments in sports teams, things like that, besides his construction business, which started in the late 90s, in his case a bit more, though he started mid 90s, you could argue, at a much slower scale. But these are very Algerian examples. Now, some a bit more original examples was what you had with Naguib Sawiris, the Egyptian magnate, who had many investments in the early 2000s in Algeria through his Orascom group, but also faced a quite public downfall that started in the late 2000 and kept on for a good chunk of the early 2010s. Again, the lawsuit's still going on. You see that's a common theme. Then what's interesting about this case specifically is that it allowed us to start showing that it's not just about Algeria. These networks of crony capitalism don't operate in a vacuum, that they're actually quite transnational. So if you have a network that's in Egypt, it's very likely to be present in Algeria or in other places, and because it is often the same people that meet in the same places. And I'll try and give a quick taste of that in this case. Then you had the BRC scandal, which built on that because there were accusations by several researchers that allegedly it had ties to much more like secret services and sovereign state issues, particularly relating to the state in Algeria, the military, but also the US. And so in that sense, it shows that there are also ties when it comes to crony capitalism, of like sometimes being a facade to topics that are of much more strategic and global nature, that you need maybe these people to oil the bigger machine of how things work. And finally, the last example was one that emerged really very recently during the Hirak. No one had heard of that person before, so they weren't very visible. Someone called Madame Maya, but her real name is Zulikha Nashinash. And basically, she was much more into the informal sector. And what's interesting is she managed to operate there as pretty much like a capitalist, except it was in illegal operations. But she managed to do it through exactly the same mechanisms and tools, which is cronyism, knowing the right people, generally the same people. And what that shows is that not only does it transcend borders, but it also transcends what we consider to be the economy. For capitalists, effectively, capital is capital, whether it's legal or illegal, defines the nature of the type of capitalist that you are. And in that case, there was a clear example that you had crony capitalism in informal segments, not just in the formal economy. So these were the case studies we looked at. Now I'm just going to talk quickly before coming back on the conclusion from each of these case studies about also the approach of how I try to look at this from a discursive point of view, if you want. There is a narrative built around all of this, and it stems from the power play between the political sponsors that try to encourage the emergence of these new capitalists because they can no longer, in the global context, function through group states or national companies. So what they did is kind of like encourage with some advantages some capitalists to emerge. That is not unusual. You can see that in many economies. But they also built on the neoliberal narrative of self-made men. You know, there was this idea that there were golden boys, that, you know, a lot of these words that they started from nothing. Now, when you look at their background, I can only think of maybe one that you could argue was the case. Khalifa was actually the son of a former minister and had many advantages that are described in the paper to starting his business. The BRC scandal involves a former minister and a former Sonatrach CEO who actually were pretty tied to former President Abdelaziz Bouteflika, childhood friends. So again, they didn't start from nothing. Madame Maya again was tied to Bouteflika quite a bit. So it's through these ties that she was able to build her networks. Naguib Sawiris, I mean, it has been argued by Forbes and many in the literature that he was the most apt of all the Sawiris children, but we all know that he didn't start from nothing and from scratch. So from that perspective, arguably, Haddad is maybe the most self-made man out of them all. But even then, it was clearly shown, like in more recent times, that he was able to achieve these things not through his hard work, but connections and networks and public contracts that were given to him in maybe less than competitive ways. So the first aspect of this narrative is kind of like, you quickly see that you have two levels to the narrative and the propaganda, if you want, or ideology put forward. One, which is the first story, which is they're self-made man, and they've been very successful at what they do. But the second level is actually, from the start, they're kind of tainted. And as quickly they become like, they're kind of like the comparison I made in the paper is Achilles. You know, Achilles was dipped in the river Styx by his mother, gave him incredible superhuman powers, but in practice it gave him also an incredible flow, which was his ultimate downfall, which was he was dipped from his heel, right? And it's the same thing here, because they were dipped through corruption and nepotism and this type of things. It became easily to take them down as soon as they accumulated too much power. And this is the question: when does their power become too much? And this is where you come to the heart of crony capitalism. On the one hand, you have capitalism producing wealth and cronyism distributing wealth. But in practice, I've simplified it and lied a bit here, because capitalism distributes wealth also through wages, and cronyism also kind of produces wealth by allocating the resources to specific sectors and specific individuals. And so what happens there is that at first, the role, the function of these crony capitalists is to provide services to their sponsors, a facade for their own wealth accumulation, a series of like financial services, political services, personal services, for instance, like money laundering you can think of, or just hiding some like state issues, some state budgets. It might be easier to go through a small company than make it official what X, Y, and Z is doing. So, but as these individuals accumulate wealth, you will remember that I mentioned that some of them had very large media groups. Some of them had very large sports teams. And all of this allows them to start accumulating political influence. None of these media groups or sports teams actually are profitable. Financially, they're appalling investments, but politically, they're very savvy investments, as we all know. So at some point, there is a temptation, because they know they are flawed and that there is a risk because of their origin story that they might be threatened and face a severe downfall. They will try to reinforce their politician by becoming political sponsors themselves. And this is when they become a threat to their own sponsors. Only a few of them, maybe one I can think of in Algeria, managed to do that. And will he forever? We do not know. But at least for most of the others, you have seen a downfall for all of them. And what happened is basically the two groups that Stefan described. You either have a purge. The Iraq is a great example. So anyone who was tied to Bouteflika, and this is why all the lawsuits are still going on nowadays, has been through this downfall. So that was notably the case of Haddad or Nashinesh. But you also have those that have shown this kind of hubris. So you can think of Sawiris, who was doing great until the moment where he got discounted factory for cement, which is a typical process to kind of encourage these crony capitalists, but then resold it to Lafarge, a large global group, for a high margin without making any investments himself or anything like that, which kind of fell to the elite at that point, like, well, we've given you disadvantages. We're sharing the money with you, but you're not sharing it back in some ways, to sum it up in a very pithily. So that was his hubris. Or you can see it with Khalifa, where he was trying to become really big, very fast. And at the end, ended up going, for lack of time, I'll take a very quick shortcut, but taking the Madoff model, if you want. And so it offended a lot of the people who were actually powerful, people who had invested in his bank, invested in some of his companies, and that didn't see where the fund had gone. Same thing for BRC. So this is how these this is how you see that there's a fundamental disparity in power between the sponsors and the actual crony capitalists in Algeria. The conclusion nowadays, on which I'll open and which will be my last point just before addressing what Stefan's comment, is that today it's where are we going? Certainly there's a talk of a new Algeria. What's quite interesting is this talk is as old as Algeria itself, maybe, but you can at least very well trace it back to the early day of colonization, where France came with a new Algeria in mind. And then in the latter days of colonization, we'll have a new Algeria where we'll all be citizens, equals, and all this stuff. But it never materializes, the new Algeria. So we've had many of them over the decades. And now we have this promise. So it might materialize, but it might not. If it does not, it will be interesting to see if there will be a new narrative, as Stefan was underlining.
You froze, Idris, and you're still frozen. We wait a bit. You have been unfrozen before. Okay, I guess you were close to the end anyway. Look, we're running late, but I think we're mostly the Algerian friends that left on this webinar, and it's just fascinating. Both presentations were absolutely fascinating. So let me see if there are some comments from the floor. Brahim.
I'm sorry, I don't want to abuse my vantage position, but I found these presentations extremely.
But keep going, Brahim. Keep going.
Yeah, actually, Mahoub, if I were an Algerian general in power, I would certainly ask you to come and share with with me this kind of essentially you know, a renewal and kind of extremely exciting you know, industrialization kind of agenda. And this reminded me really of an old paper which for some reason it got lost by Danny Roderick, and the title of the paper was a political economy paper, When Knowledge Trumps Interest. And I'm thinking about with all of these you know, climate change ramifications on and the stranded assets question and so on. You know, I mean, one would think that the powers that be in Algeria must actually start thinking ahead about you know, where they want to take the economy in the light of all of this development. So I found really the 10 elements strategy extremely interesting, and I think it applies to many countries. You know, thinking about Sudan, for example, I think I can see there are so many relevant recommendations. But I wanted actually just to ask you more substantively, because you did suggest that the experiences of global value chain integration of Morocco and Tunisia are not very successful. And in fact, I agree with you, because you know, I commented on Danny Roderick presentation at the last annual conference of the ERF, and I cited the example of Morocco, whereby even though they did actually achieve some integration on aerospace and automobiles and so on, but this, you know, didn't lead to macro economy-wide implications for job creation and for social programs and what have you. So my question is that the type of contracting or whatever you call it, which is like producing basic machines rather than just high-tech assembly and so on. Are there any kind of social implications for this to be had that would make it, you know, kind of more successful in contributing to the social agenda, like job creation, like poverty and these kind of issues. I don't know, but this is really the point I wanted to ask, because the question about Morocco was that because of the dominance of the SOEs and that these companies are not very efficient and what have you. But I found your analysis at a much deeper level in terms of that the type of contracting itself may not be the best available for these countries.
Thank you so much, Ibrahim.
Shall we take a few others and then
okay.
back to both of you to conclude? Are there other comments? I saw one in the Q&A that's interesting to both, and it's whether international pressure could push the regime to change. And I may add mine. I mean, if you can conclude on this, we have good recommendations. The world is changing. However, the oil rent has increased, so there seem to be, and the Iraq is not as active, so there are less incentives to change the system. And so 2-3 questions come to mind. One is, could international pressure play that role? The norms, the democratic norms, and the like. That's one. And second, and this is to at least to some extent, I mean, those cronies did play a role, including of creating jobs, but also of rendering political services to the political class, as you said. And it's pretty much in reaction to the Iraq, to the change in regime, that the old cronies have been disciplined, and many of them are not active anymore. So, and therefore the services they were rendering to the economy, to the polity, are not there anymore. So what is replacing them? In Egypt, we have seen military companies replacing them. Is only subsidies replacing them? Is the country becoming simply a beneficiary of subsidized services and the like? How about the jobs agenda, which Brahim asked about? Is that going to be a pressure point? So let's go back to both of you and conclude. If you like, we'll start with Idris. So this way, Mahoob, you will conclude the seminar.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I'll do my best. They are ambitious questions. Just what I was going to say when I got cut was very brief. Stefan is very correct that it would be very interesting to do more comparative studies on a lot of these topics to see how much that can be expanded, particularly why it's so anti-developmental in the case of Algeria, because it's one of the most relevant questions. I don't think we came up with cronyism or corruption even, and so it's relevant to see that. Now to your questions. I think I'll just have a brief comment on what Ibrahim was saying. I think it has a lot to do with the fragmented nature of the elites here. So it makes it very difficult to look long-term in the way that you were suggesting, because you don't know how long you're staying in the position that you're in. Effectively, you could be a general for decades, but the circle of people, of decision makers, is very limited. So you can be there one day and not the next day. And so there is a very short-termism to the nature of the elite here, which I think makes looking to the future complicated, as well as generational issues as the elites struggle to renew themselves. So it makes it harder to think 30 years ahead past a certain point, I think. So, and to the points you were underlining, Ishaq, yes, they definitely played the job. And I think here we're in at a complex moment where the elite doesn't really know where it's going, where it should be going, what's going to work and what isn't, because the global context is in flux so much. I think at one point, international pressure could have been very relevant when the price of oil was lower and you didn't have the crisis with Russia, because Algeria was looking a bit more isolated on these questions. But now with that, it's received a lot of political backing from countries like Italy, or then you've had visits from a lot of like high-level figures from the US and Russia at the same time, from France, because it is kind of a neutral country and the whole conflict, and so everyone is trying to make sure that it doesn't go to the other side, right? So if anything, I don't think that very recently, because of that, the context has changed. So right now, it doesn't seem like it would be the case. Maybe in 2 years' time, it might be again, right? Now, again, similar thing. I think at one point, the country was looking very seriously at trying to diminish imports because of the oil bill. I still think that remains for reasons of macroeconomic equilibrium necessity for the country at trying to reduce imports. But at the same time, the temptation now that oil prices are higher to kind of let the economy breathe a bit is here and necessary. You have to think it's a place where there hasn't been any new car that has officially been able to enter the country through legal means since 5 to 7 years, depending on what you count exactly how strict you want to be, but 5 years at the bare minimum. So no new cars. It's the largest car market in Africa. It's massive. It's been deprived of cars for 5 years. So this is why, depending on the price of oil on any given day, depending on who is in part of the fragmented elite, depending on what's the international context, whether you're in COVID or not, whether you can justify the reduction in like the economic crisis through a global recession, depending on all these factors, the government keeps moving through different models. The three that you see, and they're not really compatible, but effectively that's the mix we have right now, is one, at a very low level of what you were describing with Egypt, where you see the state as being more present, or at least a discourse around it. I do not think that it has delivered any concrete results from that point of view. But certainly on the subsidies front, it is massively present from that front. It is struggling to reform subsidies, and it has tried for years. The second one is import substitution, but again, it's subsidization, because we're producing at higher production cost than China ever will. So we're just subsidizing the economy through the pockets of the consumers, right? So that's the second model. The third one was the model you had when the oil prices were high. But can Algeria generate the surplus, the economics, like, you know, export surpluses that it did in the commodities boom of the 2000s nowadays? I don't think so. And I don't think that the political elite believe that it's the case. Because if they did, then we'd have massive imports of cars with new cash coming in, which would mean that you would have these capitalist cronies that we had in the past 20 to 30 years emerge again, a new generation. But the moment, even for cars, which is a very relevant example, we're kind of importing them drop by drop. It's very slow based on the oil prices and how much we can export, what volumes we can export. So at the end of the day, at the moment, by default, it is exactly what you were suggesting is happening. My point of view, it's mostly subsidies to kind of keep everyone happy, trying to find the difficult compromises, but the dust has not settled on an actual model yet.
Thank you.
To answer the question of Ibrahim for first, and then finishing by those of Isaac. The question is interesting and important because there are many examples of successful stories in the world about how companies choose their partners. I was thinking about how Samsung in the early 80s has chosen IBM to make a contract, a long-term contract, original equipment manufacturing, to deliver technological modules exclusively to IBM, and IBM exclusively to Samsung. And it was a long-term contract for 8 years. So this kind of contract is a tool of transferring knowledge and developing economies. And you have also the Taiwanese company Acer that did the same. The Canadian, the other companies group in Brazil in the automotive industry. So you have many stories to tell about how the companies decide to choose their partners. And what we see in Tunisia, and what we have seen in Tunisia and in Morocco, but also in Algeria, is that there is no strategy, no incentive to think the type of contract that could be successful for making the externalities of knowledge go and work. So this is very important to say that, because Tunisia has not, they just accepted what the French companies offers, subcontracting in assembly lines, and without any development of all the stages until the equipment parts, the equipment machines. They just accepted. And what we know is that the French companies have not the same strategies than the German companies. For example, the German companies prefer importing intermediate goods with a high level of productivity and implementing them, assembling them in Germany and exporting. And the French companies do exactly the same, the opposite. They prefer making the intermediate goods, sending them to Morocco, Tunisia, and other low-cost countries, and then make them go back to the country to be consumed. So in the one case, in the German case, it means long-term contracts, and because it's intermediate goods with higher value added. And in the French case, companies, it was just very short-term subcontracting that are very volatile, and the cost of stopping this kind of contract is zero. When the cost of going out a long-term contract is much higher. So this is I want just to say that there is a culture of law and the kind of contract that is related to the choice of sectors, the choice of the fragmentation. And when I insist on how to select knowledge-based services, it is because of the situation at the international level, where companies are offshoring in India, more and more very high competencies in artificial intelligence, etc., etc. So this is really a chance to enter in this new economy. And when you look at Algeria or Tunisia, Morocco did a little better. But when you look at Algeria and Morocco, there is no strategy, no choice. No, just let it like some collective policy, local policy makers who wants just activities to come to their countries and no more. So this is the first answer, and the first answer to the failure of the strategy of upgrading in the value chain in Morocco and Tunisia. But the other is, and I did not speak about that, but it is my obsession. The obsession I have about the region is that they all are in bilateral relations with the North. They don't have any South-South big market. So ours, the markets, the Mediterranean markets from the Maghreb to the Mashrek is so fragmented, with so high transaction costs between each country, and 4 times higher than the transaction costs between each country and Europe. So you have this hub and spoke that Krugman and Venables have described in the relationship between the region, the countries, Algeria, Morocco, etc., which are all have a huge deficit with Europe. And Europe, instead of exploiting the local market, they just put some the assembly lines and they re-import the products in Europe instead of having horizontal foreign direct investments to invest in the region. So this is another issue which is very important, which is the construction of a regional integration between all these countries. And unfortunately, the international conditions, and I'm going to switch to the question of Ishaq, are not good for that, because everybody can see that because of this new threat since 2016, in fact, since the decline of the multilateralism of the World Trade Organization, which is collapsed completely, you have this double globalization between countries that are going to change the way to decarbonize the economy, to implement a new way of fighting against the climate change, etc. And on the other hand, you have Algeria, all these kind of countries that don't want to shift to another kind of economy. They are going to exploit shale gas, which is very dangerous for the movement, because you had in 2016 a huge protestation in the Mzab, in the south of the country, against the shale gas exploitation, because people don't want that, because it's really destructive for the environment. And that's what they want. They want just to continue in being a rentier state regime, exploiting the rent and distributing it instead of accumulating investment. This is very dangerous. And I'm quite pessimist, because I think that we have these two kinds of globalization that are going with a parallel way, but they are not. And when you see at how the climate against France, for example, in the region, in sub-Saharan countries, but also in Algeria, in Morocco, etc., in Tunisia, it's something that is going to stop this transition that has started with the Hirak in Algeria. And when you see what also the Tunisian regime, this Tunisian president that has decided to take the worst ideology against immigration from sub-Saharan countries, telling that there will be a big replacement of Tunisian by sub-Saharan, we are in a very bad situation according to these reforms I propose. These reforms need to have a big market integration. The Arab free trade agreement is not. It has failed. You know that very well. It is because the non-tariff barriers have increased dramatically. So there is no relationship between the countries. And the end of the story is what the president of Tunisia said against the sub-Saharan countries' immigrants. So the only hope we have to build a real regional integration is the mobility of people, the mobility of students, a sort of Erasmus, regional Erasmus. And now it is stopping because of this geopolitical situation, which is very bad. I think we have to think the evolution of the institutions, the Iraq, the future of Iraq, with the geopolitical situation, which is really dramatically going to be fragmented. And this is not good for reforming the region, and specifically a country like Algeria. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mahoub, for these words of wisdom. We're not in a good place. Thank you all. This has been an hour overboard. I'm very bad at sharing, especially when topics are so fascinating and we could spend much longer on them as well. So thank you all for participating. Have a good weekend, and I leave the last word to Brahim.
Thank you, Ishaq. I think I should congratulate you for not being as strict moderator as you would like to, because we really very much enjoyed every bit of this fascinating presentations and discussions, and the capping of this exciting intellectual debate by Mohob. I think it's really a great food for thought for all of us going forward. And hopefully for the next wave of the Hirak, maybe we can take note of all of these important discoveries. Thank you all, and
Thank you so much.
wish you a happy weekend, as you said. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.